Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Stories of Facilitating Software Design and Architecture with me, Andrew Harmel-Law, and my co-conspirators, Andrea and Kenny. And today, our guest that we've got with us is Larisa. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself, Larisa?
Yes, sure. So my name is Larisa Feldman, and I'm an architect at a company called the REA Group. Our main software is real estate portal marketplace, realestate.com.au, and some other businesses. So I've been there for 4.5 years, and I've been an architect for the last 2.5, almost 3 years.
That sounds exciting. So do you want to share the story that you've got for us? And because we're really excited to hear.
So the story is a little bit unusual. I'm sort of unusual in a sense. I'm probably not going to talk about how I designed anything or whatnot, or maybe we'll come to that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how I have become a reluctant architect. So yeah, that's the topic for today.
Let's just jump into the story then, because that sounds really interesting. I think this happens to more than a few people, I think, in our industry. So.
Yeah, I think so. So I was born in Ukraine, which was a former Soviet Union. And the end of my education just happened to be in the 90s, where Soviet Union kind of all started to collapse and the industry started to collapse. And as I was always very curious about how things work, my education that I got was electromechanical engineering. So I spent 5.5 years, learning about big machines, the steel making plants, things like those ones. And then suddenly there is no industry. So I found a job in a small accounting companies, and that company had a piece of software that supported some scripting, and they needed some customization. So that's how I started getting into writing code. And a couple of years later, my family migrated to Australia, and I sort of thought, okay, that's a new start. How about going into something different? And with my job experience, I decided to do postgrad in software engineering. That was in 99, so that was the advent of Java. So the first Java I tried was like version 1.0.3, I think, and then my software development career started. And I was doing sort of after that 1 year of postgrad, I worked for some small companies. That was 2000, where dot-com boom happened, and there was a lot of very interesting things happening in the industry. And then I spent a couple of years in superannuation companies. So that's where, the pensions are stored and calculated in Australia. And my next big chunk of my career, I spent in National Australia Bank. So if you're not familiar with it, in Australia, we got what's called big four banks. So those are like, larger banks amongst the smaller ones. And I've spent there whooping 18 years. And the large part of that career I spent trying not to become an architect, which was quite interesting. So I spent a lot of time with an area which is called digital. Like I really don't buy into the term, because like everything's digital nowadays, but that's how big banks and big organizations, like all the organizations, call those areas digital, whatever that means. And I spent time in like internet banking. That's like, start of internet banking. And we started with 2,400 concurrent users. And by the time I left the team 4 or 5 years later, that was like over 40,000 concurrent users. And we are talking about, just Australia, which is population-wise not huge, right? So that's like a big, big change, where 4 years before we could find a quiet time in the middle of the night to do change, and suddenly there is no quiet time. You can't do change in a quiet time. You can't shut it down. So that was very, very interesting. And then I joined the corporate internet banking. That's like quite different. That was cool. And then some smaller roles here and there. And over time, kind of been shifting into the role from the software engineer into senior software engineer. And one of my last roles in there, I was principal engineer for mobile internet banking. And that was one of the another reluctant things I did in a career. I was never really passionate about mobile. So when somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, like, we need a really good principal engineer to set up standards and delivery pipelines and all of those things for mobile. Just like mobile, I'm not spending a lot of time on my mobile. I'm not like very curious about that. But yeah, I took it on, and that was very interesting and very, very different. But how it relates to the talk is that as you become more senior engineer in large organizations, you deal with a lot of architects coming to your digital channels and saying, we want to do this thing, or we want to implement that feature. And the architects, especially solution architects, they don't have the context of the system or of how things work, or some historical context, right, that you might have as a senior engineer or as a principal engineer. And I found myself explaining a lot of things about a lot of different systems. Mobile probably was one of those unusual ones where any new solution architect or domain architect comes in and there's like, we're going to do this. And I'm just like, let me tell you how mobile works, because it's so very different. It's not like you deploy something and it just appears on a website, right? It's a little bit like in desktop times, like you given a floppy disk to someone, they've installed it, and then you have no visibility to anything that happens after, right? So that's the analogy I use. I've started documenting all of that. So instead of having those conversations, I will say, this is a pre-read for you. Once you've done, come back and talk to me. And the more I became like a principal engineer and working more with architects, I found that I do less and less code, and I delegate more and more to senior engineers. And that was tough. So just before I joined mobile team, I kind of decided that like really want to go back to coding. And I did for about 2.5 years. And then it became sad. I kind of like, okay, so I'll code yet another feature. I'll try yet another framework. Kind of missed that larger picture, things. And when I went to be a principal engineer in mobile, that's kind of opened up again those opportunities to work across different lines of business, different architects. There's like payments, accounts, loans, as an internet banking app, you've got all of it, right? And it's so. But then again, it's one of the reasons I never even entertain applying for the architect role in a National Australia Bank is, as a very large organization, I kind of observed the architects were never quite happy bunch, because they can come up with this brilliant idea like how to implement a product, and all of that gets stripped away by, there is this mainframe and it can't do this, or there is this old system, it can't do this, or we don't have priority to do that. And they kind of they start very happy and they become quite sad. So, and I was never tempted, to be honest, although I was prompted and prodded a couple of times, but the sadness in their eyes, that eventual sadness kind of protected me from that. I loved working with them. They were all great guys and girls. I always had a really good relationship with them, but I was never tempted to apply. 4.5 years ago, I decided to leave financial services behind and do something very different, and joined the advertisement company, which is very different and very exciting. And although you can't say it's like a startup company or whatnot, it's a very modern, it's 30-year-old company, but it's set up quite modern way of adopting agile, not having separate product and technology. We all work together. Everything goes directly into production. It's very different. And there were quite a few shocks there for me. What do you mean everything deployed into production straight away? So there is no change panels and change reviews and all of those things. But that was really cool. And I joined as a role that was quite similar to principal engineer role. And in first year and a half, I helped to stand up big modernization program that, looks in transforming one of the oldest software onto the new platform and new technology. And I was offered do you want to apply as an architect for the role for that program? And I thought, well, that's an opportunity to actually do something the way I wanted it to, rather than do it as another architects, suggest to do it. And so, yeah, that's how I become an architect, a little bit accidentally.
Yeah. So a lot of things hit home for me. architects not being happy because, don't know enough context. But one thing I want to focus on, and I think that's an interesting observation I always see, not only with the role architect, but also business analysts or other roles, they're so rigidly defined that it becomes very binary. Right? If you become an architect, you can only do this. You cannot code anymore. And it's what Gregor Hohpe says. Do we want architects or do we want architecture? What happened with you a little bit, right? Because I think having you doing architecture is like the best thing you can ever imagine, right? We have a senior principal in a team doing coding, knowing so much context about it, letting that person do architecture. It's great, but also make sure that they're not being overwhelmed. This is what I usually often see in teams happening. And you had the same thing, right? You were organizing things in a team and doing less and less coding, right?
Yeah, I think
And
so. You just sort of don't have that much bandwidth. But I
yeah,
found myself doing bits and pieces of coding anyway. Like, I think you get drawn to it anyway. So even as an
cool.
architect, if you need to do some reporting on something and I need to look at GitHub, my first thought is like, how about I'll just write something that do it for me, right? Rather
Yeah,
than, exporting it into spreadsheet or whatnot. And
yeah.
I think it's quite powerful now with having all the AI tools, to actually not letting that go. And for me, software engineering is something that I hold really dear. So for me, any architecture that makes life for software engineers really hard is not a really good architecture, to be honest, because their experience and how well they can work is quite important for me as well. So I think you get less coding because you just don't have less bandwidth. But I think if an architect still have that desire to code, they're probably in the right job, I think.
I see that this struggles a lot with engineers that don't want to become that full-time architect, want to still, but they're the main person in the team and then get overwhelmed by all the meetings they're in. And it's sort of like at some points, as I feel that myself as now an architect enabler, if the knowledge is not shared in a way, the person in the team gets overwhelmed with meetings. And that's a struggle I see a lot of engineers struggling with because they want to do more architecture, but they don't want to get overwhelmed with meetings.
Maybe a bit controversial. I think some senior developers that gets drawn into that sort of architecture discussions and whatnot, they probably would be more useful and more happier if they are as a advisor role rather than being, drawn into actually doing an architecture and, being drawn into those meetings. I think there is a lot of, once you get into some of those, really strong software engineers at the staff level, you can find that their happy place is like just them and a computer or maybe pair programming with someone. But in a larger audience and in the meetings, it's not their happy place. So I think it's okay. We need these people too. They excel at what they do. I think somebody maybe less experienced but more curious and could be a better candidate to grow as an architect. Sometimes
Yeah,
that's my don't know my two
I think
cents.
I try to do that, right? I try to facilitate these people in teams and move some of the burden that the role gives them. But then the danger I always see is that a lot of knowledge centralizes towards me. So you want to make sure that the knowledge of this whole system is available for the teams to move on, right? It's sort of like a symbiotic relationship if you're not careful and you want to step out of it. I think that's a good one, right? How can we make sure that these people start advising instead of taking on the burden of dealing with all the politics or dealing with all the other things around? Yeah.
If only there was a thing about advice and decisions, Andrew.
I know. I completely relate to that, Larisa, right? Because as soon as someone gets the word architect in their job title, they end up they get, like you say, they have to go to meetings, but then they become blockers, and so they don't get enough time to do any of the things that they need to do. But like Kenny said, advice is more like, you could even do it async, right? Like lots of stuff I coach people on these days is like, maybe you're not like, you don't like standing up in meetings and having an opinion and then having your opinions challenged, because that's not, you need time to think. But if you can write stuff down, which might not be one of your skills, but you can learn to write stuff down and then provide like written advice and input and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a big deal, and it can really transform things, right? Like then you can get these people who might be more happy sitting down on their own or in a pair. They can still have an impact, but they don't have to turn up at meetings and stand in front of whiteboards and point at things. Yeah, I think it's super powerful. Andrew, you were going to say something there, I think, or you?
No. Actually, I was thinking of about how common it might or might not be to be a reluctant insert something, as in like in Larisa's case. She's like, oh, I didn't really want to be an architect because, I mean, they look kind of sad and I don't want to be sad. But I think my question is about the general picture, or like the generalization of that. What does it mean for your career? How can you see in the future? Like, for example, we're here now. Each of us have our own careers now. What's in our future? And what are we kind of not evaluating because we don't think we want it, but also it's hard to know until you're in the role. Like, for example, from Larisa, your story, I get that you're actually enjoying it now, even though you didn't want to be an architect for a long time. And that's because you're in not just an architect. It's not the right role, but it's the right role in the right place. And I think as we are kind of further in our careers, the roles become less well-defined, and we have to kind of have this inner the introspection to kind of see what are we going to do next, and kind of try to find it rather than letting us choose it for us. I don't know. That's where I was when you caught me in the thinking phase.
Yeah, I think you know, it probably depends where as well. You know, it's not just like the role of architect is so different depending on the company. And sometimes it's very rigid. You do just this, right? Like in a big bank, you will have your integration architects, solution architects, domain architects, enterprise architects, you know, and each role has got very specific things. Where if you look at REA, like we are just the group of architects, and whatever we deem architecture we do, right? And I find some aspects of the architect role very appealing, and I like it very much, some less so. But I think a lot of things that architects did, which I didn't see a value of, started to become apparent, right? Because you get dragged into things that you haven't been, you know, in some of the discussions or in some of the, you know, in some of the initiatives at a different level when they just start up, or, you know, like it's very different way of looking at things. You look at across organization, you look at different initiatives, you're trying to draw the line. So your field of vision is quite wide. It's not very narrow. So certain activities that architects do, and I'm just like, oh, why would they do it? Like mapping the capabilities of systems or something like that. It's now kind of quite apparent why. So like I might be enjoying it a bit more because now I see a reason why, or, you know, which is good. So yeah, I'm definitely enjoying it. Sure.
Yeah, I often see architects in that role, and not even architects, but everyone in this leadership role. It starts well, right? You want to have engineers and teams do engineering. And you say, oh, okay, there's all these stuff that we need to think about holistically. So let's pull that out, which is maybe a good thing. Let's pull that out to a role. However, I often see that role not reflecting, are we still enabling the teams to do their work better, or are we just self-fulfilling? I see it with managers as well. Yeah, they're really looking for us to make decisions, right? And because they don't have the capacity to do it or the cognitive load to do it, that's usually along the lines what I usually hear, right? And the architects as well, teams don't look holistically. Sure, that's correct. But if you then just say, that's why we are here, that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then you stop looking at what do the teams actually need. Teams might need guidance and understanding about the holisticness, and then they can make decisions themselves. That's the thing what I hear you say with the story, right? The solution architect came, but they don't understand the context. It reminds me a little bit of the in our village, to get something done on your house, then someone from another village somewhere far away will make a decision if you're allowed to do that or not. And then you're not allowed according to these and these rules. And I'm like, well, have you seen my neighborhood? Other people do it, right? And because they're not living in the village, they don't know the context of the village. So they make very weird decisions in a way. And then they have all this form of control over it. What I hear you say, right? And that's maybe so off-putting to a lot of engineers, I guess, right? You don't want to be in that role without context, trying to make decisions that cannot be done anyway. Is that something that didn't want to make you an architect in that role?
Yeah, I think that's one of the aspects. And another one is that like vision really, transformed into what they saw it to be because of gazillions of different limitations and inability to make decisions quickly, as in any large organization, an old organization. But like, I think you're quite right about like engineering community overall in some organizations just trying to ignore the architects and the function of architecture, kind of like those people in the next village. So they just ignore what they say and just do what I want in my house, and as my neighbor did. I think at REA we are a bit better. At least we do try. We try to listen to the community, and there are channels they can, tell us if you're doing a bad job or need to look at something, and we try to measure how well we're doing our job for the development community as well as for our stakeholders. So I think that is quite important. At least it's very important for me, because I think if you're not there as that glue between the development community and leadership, then it's not quite clear why we're needed.
Maybe perhaps the one of the last questions as we're getting to time. Do you find that you spend more time thinking about influence and communication? And can you describe perhaps that swap? As in, like, are you more deliberate in your communication and perhaps spend more or time than before? And how did you, if that's happening, then how did you learn those skills?
Definitely, I do, and at a different level of stakeholders. So the context and tone of voice and the right level of details is quite important. Started as being a really blunt person, to be honest, and I had to learn along the way to pick the words and put things in a context. And I'm one of those unfortunate people that can have everything clear in my mind but sometimes struggle to explain, and because sometimes it's just based on experience and you have a gut feel that scene won't work as well as you think it will, but it's very hard to articulate. So over the years, I tried to learn how to kind of extract it from my brain on paper or digital media to kind of crystallize it. You kind of like learn it through your career. And I think if somebody has an ambition to become an architect or principal engineer, they just need to look for opportunities, and opportunities in my view are always there. Like if you know something that only you know or have some historical context, you can always, put it on paper and share it as a blog post or just something on, Confluence so people would know. So I kind of did it through the last, I don't know, maybe 15 years. So I found it relatively easy joining the architecture team from that aspect. One thing I found a little bit challenging is you kind of deal with executives and general managers more, and that's like a different level of thinking about the business as you're even head of product. So that kind of level of vision, even though I kind of thought, okay, I have got that level of vision, and for the architecture and the systems, I had a very little understanding how business and product people do it at that level. So that's quite fascinating to even look at that as well. So that's an interesting. And how they communicate is very, very, very high standards. Let's put it this way.
Interesting. Thanks, Larisa, for that and all the other stuff. There's a few things that you said I'm going to be thinking about. Like, The thing that hit me most was it needs to make like the things you do as an architect need to make the developers' lives better, or it need to be useful and beneficial to the developers, because otherwise it won't have any impact. And I think that's a big deal. But I think we're out of time, so thanks very much for sharing your story, and it was very different from lots of the other ones we hear. So thank you very much for taking the time and
Thank you.
sharing everything with us. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.